Hello, and thank you all for joining us for today's National Conference of State Legislatures webinar, Federal Stimulus and What It Means for States. My name is Mandy Rafel, and I'm the Director of NCSL's Fiscal Affairs Program. Let's see. If you're not familiar with NCSL, we are a bipartisan organization that serves the legislators and legislative staffs of the nation's 50 states, commonwealths, and territories. NCSL provides research, testimony, and opportunities for lawmakers to exchange ideas on pressing state policy issues. This is the second event in NCSL's 5-part fall fiscal webinar series, Budgets, Taxes, and Pensions, Oh My. The 3 remaining webinars will be held on Thursdays between now and November 19th. For more information on NCSL's meetings, activities, and services to legislators and legislative staff, please visit the website ncsl.org. Before I introduce our speakers, I want to review a few housekeeping items. Today's webinar is a platform for information and exchange and engagement. Over the next 60 minutes or so, we encourage participation through our chat box on the lower right-hand side of your screen. So feel free to type your questions and respond to any questions in the chat box. To get some practice with the chat function and to also learn who's on the line today right now, I invite you to type your state name in now, and then we'll hold a formal Q&A for our speakers later on in the agenda. Just looking to see. Okay, yes. Type in your states. Okay, so lastly, a video recording of this event will be made available on NCSL's website in the next few days. So now that housekeeping is out of the way, let's get back to why we're all here. The federal government has authorized billions in state aid in response to the coronavirus pandemic. So today we will discuss the coronavirus relief packages, if states have benefited, how they've spent their funds, and more. We have an outstanding lineup of speakers for you today. And in a moment, we'll be joined by Marcia Howard, who's the Executive Director of Federal Funds Information for States. Marcia will be giving an overview of federal relief to the states. Marcia will be followed by Emily Mayer, who's a policy associate in NCSL's Fiscal Affairs Program. And Emily's been focusing on state actions and oversight to the coronavirus relief funds. And then we'll hear from Kathy Schill and Eric Nauman, who are both legislative fiscal staff in Minnesota. Kathy is a fiscal analyst with the House of Representatives, and Eric is the lead fiscal analyst in the Senate. They're each going to spend a few minutes providing some insight into Minnesota's experience in spending the coronavirus relief funds and the role of the legislature. Minnesota is particularly interesting because it's the only legislature in the country right now that has split party control. So we look forward to hearing about the spending process there. So with that, I am going to turn the screen over to Marcia.
Thanks, Mandy. It's really nice to be here with all of you. I am going to be speaking today from a set of slides that I think you have available to you. So we'll just follow through with those. And if you have any questions, you have this chat box here. So we will move along and be able to answer them. I hope. So this is indeed a year unlike any other, and that's something for which I think we're all pretty grateful at this point, at least for the other years, maybe not so much this one. So what I'd like to do is start with what we've seen so far. So the slide shows the relief legislation that has passed to date. The blue boxes are the 4 bills that have already been enacted. And you can see there, it also indicates kind of what the focus of those bills was. So the first one, the coronavirus preparedness and response, was $8.3 billion, and it was really around some of the early health issues. The second one was the Families First Coronavirus Response Act. It was closer to $200 billion, and that was the one that had the temporary 6.2% increase in the Medicaid matching rate, and as well as other programs to assist unemployed workers. The granddaddy of them all, the big one, was the CARES Act, which was scored at $1.7 trillion. That included the Coronavirus Relief Fund, but of course, scores of programs received lots of funding in that, and we'll touch on those in a second. The fourth was kind of a cleanup bill to extend the Paycheck Protection Program, as well as put some additional money into the healthcare sector. And that was almost $500 billion. Also assistance for other businesses, hospitals, testing. So those are the four that are in place now. And then since that the last of those, I think, was passed in May, maybe even maybe April. And then the House came in and passed the HEROES Act, which was another very large bill. It was $3.5 trillion. The House has subsequently passed what they're calling a skinny HEROES Act. It's not that skinny. It's been scored at $2.4 trillion. So again, very robust federal assistance in that bill. The Senate has not actually been able to advance a bill. It proposed the HEALS Act about a month ago, and that was about $1 trillion. And then just this week, it came in with what it was calling a skinny HEALS Act. And that was priced out at about $100 billion. And again, it failed to advance. So the Senate hasn't really been able to do anything. So we've been now several months, the early months, 4 bills very quickly. The last 4 months, no bills and a lot of debate. So when we look at the pieces and the components of these, the next slide shows the enacted funding to date. And you can see that a lot of the funding is concentrated in 2 areas. One is HHS, of course, because this is a health crisis. So much of the funding is running through health programs. And then the other is running through Treasury, and that is the Coronavirus Relief Fund. And then in addition to that, you have funding in some of these other federal programs, but to a large extent that it pales in comparison to those 2 big areas. And you'll note, importantly, the footnote at the bottom shows that the figures shown here don't include the increase in the Medicaid matching rate, because that increase depends on what state spending is. It's not a grant program per se. So it is not included in those numbers. And you can see again on the far right of the bar chart that that's about a $505 billion that we're tracking, that's money flowing through states so far in enacted legislation. So I mentioned that the House came in with the HEROES Act, and this bar chart shows kind of the focus of the HEROES Act. And the first thing I want to point out is the very large price tag. We estimate that almost $1.5 trillion would be in programs that states would have some passing interest in. And of course, $1 trillion of it alone is in that big portion in the middle, because the House does include aid to state and local governments in the HEROES Act. And not only does it include that aid, but it includes it one independently of the other. So there's aid for states and there's aid for locals. And you probably know and have been living with the fact that because the Coronavirus Relief Fund had rather pesky provisions for providing assistance to local governments, and Congress came in and the administration came in after the fact saying, well, we really think you should be spending 45% of your state money on locals, even though the legislation didn't say that. The House was more explicit this time around to make sure that local governments got a specified portion of it. And then in addition to that, you see a lot of money there for HHS programs, again, not surprisingly, as well as education, HUD, other areas that receive funding. So then when the Senate came in behind the House with its more limited bill, that's shown on the next slide. And here we're tracking less than $200 billion in assistance that would go to state and local governments. Importantly, it's missing that component of direct aid. And you can see here it's really divided sort of half and half, with a big focus on funding for education, especially in the Senate bill. And a lot of that was tied to reopening schools and conditioned on reopening schools. And then, of course, HHS and then other areas as well. And as I say, this never even got to a vote in the Senate. So it never made it to the Senate floor to get any support or not. So as we look at those House proposal, Senate proposal, where we are, this is really a summary from the perspective of state and local governments of where we kind of stand with these things. And, you know, these debates are ongoing this week, so it's really still the same issues. The first is in the total cost, that the House wants to really go big and the Senate wants to keep it much more narrowly focused. So a big difference in total costs. State local aid has been a huge stumbling block, and as we understand it, remains probably the most significant stumbling block in getting an agreement. Right now, the administration is negotiating with the House on some kind of package. And we understand that the two main stumbling blocks are state local aid, which the House is insistent on, and the Senate and the administration have been cooler to. And then liability protections for businesses, which the administration and Senate are very keen to have, and the House is less insistent on. The other difference is in the Medicaid matching rate. In the current legislation, there's a 6.2 percentage point increase. It remains in effect through the end of the quarter in which the public health emergency ends. Right now, the public health emergency, the current extension goes into January of 2020, which means that 6.2 FMAP is in place until at least the end of March. Every likelihood is that the public health emergency will get extended and that 6.2 will continue beyond that date, but we don't know that yet. The Senate just keeps that current law as it is, but the House bill has increased the additional FMAP. Instead of 6.2, they increase it by 14 percentage points. They keep that in place through fiscal year 2021, federal fiscal year 2021, and then revert back to the 6.2, assuming the public health emergency is still in place. So another big difference between the House and the Senate. And then finally, the big difference is in the additional unemployment insurance that's provided from the federal government, the Federal Pandemic Unemployment Insurance, or FPUC. The House would restore or, put that thing in place again. As you know, it ended at the end of July at a level of $600 per week, while the Senate, in various iterations, has talked about doing it at $200 a week or $400 a week with other kinds of triggers and clauses in there. So that's the fourth area where there are some notable difference between the House and the Senate and how they want to proceed. So what is a public health emergency? It was declared on January 31st. It's been renewed 3 times since then on the dates shown on the slide. A public health emergency, by definition, is of 90 days duration, but can be extended for as long as the public health emergency exists. In this case, the public health emergency is linked to the 6.2 percentage point FMAP increase that I described. And under the current extension of the PHE, that 6.2 will go through March of 2021. There are also other flexibilities in the pandemic relief packages that are tied to the public health emergency, other flexibilities and waivers and whatnot, especially in the HHS arena. And just as a point of reference, we have states calling us a lot who are concerned that the 6.2 FMAP is going to expire. It's going to expire at the end of January. That's going to be it. Or it's going to expire soon, and that's going to be it. That's going to be it. And just as a point of reference, these public health emergencies can, in fact, go on for quite a while. In the case of the opioid epidemic, the Secretary of HHS declared a public health emergency in October of 2017 and has continually renewed that PHE. So it's still in effect 3 years later. So they can last. So as we've gone through these iterations of aid to state and local governments and funding of various programs, I think some of the lessons that have emerged from this exercise, and the big first one, I think, is that state unemployment insurance systems really weren't up to the task. And heavens knows that they had no reason to anticipate that they would be hit with the caseloads as large and quickly as they were. But certainly we've seen some of the cracks in those systems, and probably a need for states and the federal government to put some effort and resources into updating and improving the UI systems. I think we also learned that flexible grants aren't always very flexible. And I talked earlier about the Coronavirus Relief Fund, which was a flexible grant, but it couldn't be used to backfill lost revenues. And it was supposed to be used to give to local governments. So even when there weren't explicit mandates on how that money got spent, there were sometimes implicit ones that became just as burdensome. And that's the mandates. They have a way of creeping in. One of the provisions in the Senate bill that I talked about that hasn't gotten to the floor would only give money to states for education if states opened up schools for in-school learning. You know, all these little kinds of mandates find a way of creeping in when the feds are dealing with state and local governments, which really leads to the next one, which is that partnership seems a little bit frayed right now between states and local governments. If you were around during ERA, you may recall that there was a real federal-state partnership there to get money out and deployed. There were lots of meetings, weekly meetings between states and local governments and representatives of both around reporting and spending and what was allowed and how to really, try to get through this thing. And this time it's been a much more confrontational relationship, I think, more states versus the federal government than kind of working on this together. So that's been a real change I've seen, having lived through both of these. And one of the things with these mandates on local aid is if you say to states, well, we want you to spend 45% of what you get on local aid. Well, in some states that makes sense, and in some states that doesn't make sense. There are a number of states, especially some of the smaller states, where a large share of state local expenditures are made by states. Delaware comes to mind as a state that performs a lot of functions at the state level that in other larger states are performed by local governments. Similarly, Rhode Island. So if you're suddenly saying, well, you're going to, carve in stone 45%, it really doesn't give states the flexibility they need to respond to the conditions on the ground. And I guess the last thing is that having been through some of these, what we've seen, I think, through history is that the increase in the Medicaid matching rate turns out to give states the flexibility that other types of aid really don't. And so it really makes you think, it might be nice if there were some kind of statutory provision where states' FMAP could be increased based on some kind of triggers. And of course, employment is typically the quick trigger that you're going to see where the need comes up as states' employment and unemployment levels start to change as the economic conditions dictate. So these are some of the thoughts that we've had as we've observed what's happening in Washington and how it's playing out in the states. So just to pivot for a quick second, we're currently in October of the year, which means the fiscal year began at the beginning of the month. So because we don't have an enacted budget in place this year, like many others, is starting with a continuing resolution. And the continuing resolution is in place through December 11th. It extends the highway bill, which expired at the end of September. The highway bill needs to be extended so that it can operate. So rather than just extending it to December 11th, this CR extends it all the way through the next fiscal year to September 30th of 2021. It also extends some mandatory programs that also require authorization so they can operate. And that includes TANF and the Child Care Development Fund and a host of other programs. Importantly, it delays Medicaid disproportionate share cuts, but only until December 11th. And then it extends through September of next year, some of the child nutrition flexibilities that were provided in the CARES Act. So the CR does all of these things, but it only goes through December 11th. So Congress is going to have to come back in a lame duck session to address some of the things that are in there that expire at that time. And then my dog is coming downstairs, so if you hear this clomping, I apologize for that. Minding the calendar, we, as I said, had the fiscal year begin on October 1. At that time, the main education bill, the ESSA, expired, as did the workforce bill that dictates the funding around the Department of Labor programs. The good news about these is that because they're just discretionary programs, Congress can continue to fund the grants even if the underlying legislation has expired. We also had the Secure Rural Schools program expire, but there's a lag in how that funding runs, so that's not a pressing issue. We had the full phase-in of the reduction, that's kind of a tongue twister, a mind twister, in CHIP funding. CHIP got a 23% percentage point increase in the Affordable Care Act. Last year was a transition year to knock that increase down to 11 percentage points. And then this year it's back down to 0. So CHIP is operating at its underlying baseline level. And then, of course, as I mentioned, on December 12th, the CR will have expired. So everything that is contingent on it or in it will need to be addressed again. And on December 31st, there's a bunch of CARES Act provisions around unemployment insurance and your National Guard Title 32 spending and so forth that also expire. So these are things that Congress will need to give some time and attention to when they return for a lame duck session. So that's it. And again, I apologize for the big dog harumphing and garumphing, but I'm happy to take any questions you might have at the appropriate time. Thanks.
Great. Thanks, Marcia. So we're going to turn over to Emily now. And I just want to remind everyone that we will take questions after everyone's presented. And to ask a question, just type it in the audience chat box. So Emily, take it away.
Okay, great. Thanks so much, Mandy. And thanks, Marcia, for that great presentation. Again, my name is Emily Mayer. I'm a policy associate in the Fiscal Affairs program at NCSL. We've been closely tracking the federal relief packages that Marcia explained earlier, especially how states are utilizing relief dollars to respond to the pandemic. And since she provided such a comprehensive overview of the packages, I'll be honing in on the CARES Act and the coronavirus relief funds, which I will refer to as CRF throughout the presentation. We'll briefly examine the eligible expenses before diving into the trends and ways states are allocating their CRF. And finally, we'll touch on oversight measures states have taken. So the CARES Act established the Coronavirus Relief Fund. The U.S. Treasury began disbursement of the $150 billion to state, local, and tribal governments at the end of April. And since then, Treasury has posted and updated guidance and FAQ of how those funds can be spent. The three main takeaways under the guidance are expenditures need to be directly related to COVID-19. As I'm sure we're all aware of at this point, they cannot be accounted for in the budget before March 27th, and the funds must be spent by December 30th. So that deadline is a really key point there as well. And according to the National Governors Association in a recent survey released yesterday, states and territories have allocated 89% of their CRF, and approximately 62% of their CRF has been obligated. So states are really working hard to get those funds out the door. So under the guidance, some examples of eligible expenses are shown here in green. Ineligible or not recommended expenses are highlighted in red. This is certainly not an exhaustive list, but I'm going to pull a few here for the purpose of time. So states can use their CRF towards payroll support and hazard pay programs as long as those expenses are substantially dedicated to mitigating and responding to the crisis. States can use the CRF towards tech and broadband infrastructure, including telehealth, telework, distance learning, these are all eligible expenses. I have an asterisk here because there was quite a bit of questions early on as to whether or not these are eligible expenses, because oftentimes these infrastructure projects are very lengthy in terms of the time it takes to get them up and running and actually implemented. So as long as that is spent by December 30th, that is eligible. So states are spending somewhere between $20 to $100 million for this type of expansion. Increased workers' compensation is eligible for first responders and critical workers, including payroll and benefit costs associated for public employees. The fund may also be used for the non-federal matching requirements for FEMA. And then unemployment insurance costs. Remember, the CRF expenses in this category are eligible or were eligible for the state's portion of the Lost Wage Assistance Program. So there are quite a bit of states taking advantage of this eligible expense. We'll get to that in a bit here. In red, examples of expenditures that are not eligible or not recommended include the big one here, revenue replacement. So even though there has been losses as a consequence of the virus, particularly for sales and personal income, tax revenue heavy states, the CRF cannot be used towards that revenue replacement, towards backfilling those revenues. Long-term loans are acceptable under the guidance. However, they're not necessarily recommended for their long-term goals. So they really need to be spent by December 30th. That's why a lot of states are turning to grants and short-term loan programs to get those businesses support by the deadline. A recipient would not be permitted to pay for payroll or benefit expenses like severance pay to private employees and other financial assistance. And in general, capital improvement and projects are not eligible expenses. However, funds may be used for expenses like establishing a temporary medical facility or other measures to increase treatment capacity, to improve mitigation measures, and anything really related to construction costs in that specific area. So at this time, before we really dig into the trends, I want to hear from you. Where is your state prioritizing funds? We're going to pull up a poll question here. If you could take a moment to select where your state is prioritizing those funds most. Is it in local governments, small business relief, housing, unemployment? We'd love to hear your responses. We'll take a moment here just to gather those responses. And while you all are responding, I just wanted to give a quick plug. We are closely tracking the state actions on CRF in a database. Please feel free to check it out on NCSL's website. And if you are answering other to the poll question, I'd love to hear, what particular expense that's going to, what unique expense that's going to. Okay, great. We're going to pull up the survey results at this time. Oh, actually, we're going to wait just a second here. I apologize. This is the first time I'm using this type of poll question in our webinar platform. So while that poll is being answered, there was a question in the chat box from Jason Powell from Virginia, actually. He's asked, have states used their CRF to invest in clinical trials, drug discovery projects for COVID-related symptoms? Any guidance in this area? We have not seen any states do this in particular. A lot of the funding that is going towards clinical trials or drug discovery projects are being sent to universities to kind of get those trials up and running. So I apologize, I misspoke, that those are going directly usually to universities or institutions that have the capability to expand those sort of projects or services. So yes, Jason, we are seeing some states doing that. Okay, great. So this time we're going to pull up those results. Okay, so we're seeing a lot of states now dedicating funds to unemployment and workforce. Hopefully you can see those results. I'm seeing them on my end. There's also the second and third highest response are education, health, EMT, and human services. So it's really interesting because states are responding uniquely to the virus when the virus really impacted their state or continues to impact their state, and responding to kind of pivoting their services as the years go on. Okay, so we are seeing similar trends. The following categories are the major trends that we're seeing. The majority of states are sending funds to local governments, cities and counties that were not included in direct allocations from Treasury. This is happening most often through reimbursements. Small business relief, typically in the form of grants to employers based on business size, or even specific groups like minority women or veteran-owned businesses. We're also seeing some targeted industry grants, in particular to things like agriculture or hospitality. Education support to K through 12 and higher ed were really big buckets in the summer as states were figuring out how to send dollars to local school districts, to institutions, and really figuring out ways that students were adapting to receiving their education experience. Some eligible expenses in this category also include increased transportation funding for schools through busing. And of course, public health, human services, and emergency responses are really big buckets here. Hazard pay, procurement for supplies like PPE, grants to fire and EMS. There's also been grants to nonprofits and childcare facilities, and efforts to address food insecurity and to support mental health and domestic violence programs. And as I mentioned earlier, a few states are taking advantage of that FEMA match. It's also worth noting agency reimbursements are not listed on this slide as they really fall under all categories, but this has been an action that all states are taking, particularly for payroll expenses, telework expansion, facilitating public health safety and sanitization, so we can get those public employees back to work in a safe way. And a few unique examples I wanted to point out. Ohio and Wisconsin have sent dollars to the National Guard in their response role to mitigating the virus. Michigan created a grant safety program for businesses for OSHA compliance during this time. There's also been quite a few states that have devoted CRF to public health campaigns, tourism to the state, and Hawaii has sent funds for an airport screening program. So states are really working to fit the guidance into their unique situations. And then I think this slide popped up a little bit earlier, so you got a sneak peek, but there have been some shifting trends throughout the year, notably in the last few weeks. In the beginning, we saw many states dedicating funds to local governments, small businesses, public health, and education. And while these still remain priorities, more recently, there's been a push to direct unspent funds to housing and rental assistance, workforce, and unemployment insurance to keep their funds solvent. And likely this is because there hasn't really been any action from Washington on a fourth package. And all of these headlines have been pulled in the last 4 weeks or so. And it is true that states were already allocating funds to these areas, but we've seen a quick or an uptick in the last few weeks within those specific areas. And some states have decided to even hold funds to decide what priorities would arise later in the year. And reallocating is occurring a bit more at this point, especially as we're coming up against that deadline. And yet there are still issues that remain with the CRF. The guidance and FAQs have been released in piecemeal, making it difficult to fully understand eligible and ineligible expenses. Since April, the guidance has been updated 4 times and FAQs 7 times. This is likely why we saw some delay in allocation, amongst other reasons, such as a potential for a deadline extension, flexibility in dollars, and additional funding in a fourth package, as Marcia explained early on. And as alluded to earlier, there is some ambiguity in the language, making it challenging to interpret. Over 70% of states are struggling with the restrictions on CRF use of funds, and 60% say that the guidance is their biggest challenge according to a recent survey by the Government Finance Officers Association, which also came out this week. States' authority and spending varies, whether it is legislative or executive. This took some time for states to iron out in the beginning, since the CRF is an unanticipated federal fund. And there has, as I mentioned earlier, been some background or back and forth in Washington. NCSL is also tracking oversight measures on federal dollars. Almost all 50 states and territories have created or proposed ways to oversee and distribute information related to funds. There are 21 states where it is clear whether it is the executive or the legislature that has the spending authority. The remaining 29 fall into an advisory role, conditional control, meaning that the legislature defers to the executive branch when out of session, or joint control. The two branches sit together to share decisions. So it really, runs the gamut across states who has spending authority and figuring out how to move forward with those roles. And most states are actively sharing their CRF expenditure allocation information with their agencies and with the public. I pulled a few examples and screenshots here just to show how states are releasing that information. Oklahoma, as part of the legislature's agreement with the executive branch, the House and Budget Committee is requiring the governor's office to publish daily reports. In Vermont, the Joint Fiscal Office has set up a database broken down by administration allocations and allocations reviewed by the Joint Fiscal Office. Alabama and Montana have used Power BI to display their information, and Minnesota Management and Budget Office, which Kathy may talk about in a little bit here, has received CRF dollars to create a COVID-19 Response Accountability Office, which is tracking funds through an online checkbook of expenditures and a report updated frequently. And lastly, the top middle screenshot is from the Texas Comptroller's Office. They have a tool that is tracking all revenue and expenditures, including their state CRF measures. So with that's the conclusion of my presentation. Thank you so much for your time. I'm going to turn it over to Kathy or Mandy, whoever pops in, to give us an on-the-ground perspective of what Minnesota is doing. Please feel free to ask any questions or reach out after the presentation. I'll do my very best to respond.
Great. Thank you, Emily. I guess I'll pop in here. So we're going to go ahead and hear from Kathy. And unfortunately, Eric Nauman from the Minnesota Senate has had some technical issues, so he won't be joining us. But Kathy is very capable and will go ahead and share his Senate perspective as well. So Kathy, go ahead and...
Good afternoon, and thank you, Mandy and Emily and Marcia. Your presentations are just totally awesome. I am going to try to give you a snapshot of what has been happening in Minnesota. And basically, I've been asked to answer the questions: who determined how funds were spent? Where was there a legislative role? And what issues did you encounter when trying to allocate funds? Well, my focus will be on CARES Act monies. There are a number of different coronavirus activities that have happened in Minnesota, but I will focus on these in particular. And to start off with, just so you know, in Minnesota, this is a pretty sensitive political issue with respect to how to allocate CARES Act monies. More so perhaps with the Senate than with the House. You see, the backdrop is the Senate is controlled by the GOP, the House is democratically controlled, and our governor is a Democrat. And so you'll find a lot of the issues that you see at the federal level at play here within the microcosm of Minnesota. Now, with respect to CRF in particular, many bills were introduced in both chambers during the regular session, and they addressed a variety of issues, including housing, small business grants, broadband and school technology, public health uses, and a number of other things I won't mention at this time, but only a handful of those bills passed. And of course, we were and our regular session finished in May. And so during this particular time, we were trying to do a number of different things in addition to coronavirus funding, supplemental budget bill, bonding bill, and such. And so a number of these issues came into the political realm, which left us high and dry at the end of regular session. A lot of work had been done on bills in each chamber, and we just basically didn't have an agreement on coronavirus funding. We fell into special session in June, our first special session, and after we failed to reach an agreement even there, the governor stepped in. In the end, the governor controlled the process for distributing CRF monies. In a non-session time period, existing law that oversees this spending of federal funds kicked in, and this requires oversight from the Legislative Advisory Commission, which is a 6-member joint committee with authority to review and grant special funding requests of federal funds. Once again, though, this is just an advisory body. Even if all 6 legislators objected to a spending request, the spending can go forward. And this is basically what happened. So since early June, the governor has submitted 73 requests for CRF funding totaling $1.7 billion. About $69 million has yet to be unallocated. Early requests for LAC monies were used for immediate needs. Department of Health with critical care supplies, testing, contract tracing, Department of Human Services for EBT monies, emergency SNAP, homeless, shelter requests, food bank requests. Then midsummer, we had requests for operational costs, including those of state agencies and the legislature and the judiciary. The major component of CRF funding is actually distributions to local governments. 841 million of the total 1.87 billion directed to the state. And for those distributions, this is the great part of it. The governor used the House and Senate agreed to base that was contained in Senate File 47 of the regular session. Now, negotiations went back and forth, and that bill obviously didn't pass, but the base part of the bill, without any earmarks, actually became the vehicle that the governor used. And so looking back on that, what were some of the issues that we worked through, House and Senate? Well, I've got 5 bullet points here. How much money, the overall amount of money, how you take that 45% state share, is that applied to what the state got directly or the overall amount going to the state, which would have had included Hennepin and Ramsey counties. The second thing that we spent quite a bit of time is how to allocate funds to different types of local governments. We ended up coming up with a formula, a certain amount for counties, certain amount for cities, with populations greater than 200, certain amount for smaller cities and towns. Another thing debated were the actual uses, what to include. Now, of course, we had to follow federal guidance, and everything that was there had to be within the guidance, but there was also the expectation that these funds would cover local government, workers' comp claims, and the FEMA costs that Emily had talked about. There would not be separate funding for that. Another issue is how to administer and track funding. It was decided using existing distribution points to the Department of Revenue that they would actually distribute the funds, but that local governments would actually report back to our management and budget office for tracking funds. And then also, which became an issue, is how to recapture unused funds to allow for alternative last-minute uses by the state. One of the things that we built in was a use-by date of December 1st for any monies that were not expended. They have to be returned to management and budget by December 10th. So then there was this question, okay, so we have between December 10th and December 30th, and the legislature would still want to have some sort of input there. I think the real success story is how quickly the state distributed the CRF monies and how quickly the local governments collaborated with local partners to produce their own CARE Act expenditure plans. We've been tracking some of this. We had a first report on July 31 that showed about 75% of the funds were going for some sort of payroll support. I don't have the detail right at my fingertips, whether that was private or public, but I think it was a combination of both. 12% for public health measures, 10% for economic support, but that was mid-July. A lot of time has passed since then, and from what I've been able to track on Association of Minnesota Counties and our League of Minnesota City websites, is that the spending varies greatly, not only by local government type, but also by geography. And then one final note I'm going to put in is that House File 1 of Special Session 5, which just finished last week, actually became law yesterday. And this contained a provision to replace some of the general fund monies that were used for coronavirus uses. And we'll have a provision to switch out those general fund expenditures using CRF monies. And that's basically what I've got. I will turn it back to Mandy, Emily, and I appreciate the time. Thanks.
Great. Thank you, Kathy. We have a few minutes for questions. I don't know, let's see. Go ahead. If you do have a question, type it in the audience chat box. Emily, there's I don't know if it's really a question, but Ellen has a comment about Arizona and how they're using their CRF fund. Do you want to comment on that? Emily? No? Okay. Okay. Any other questions here? Emily. So Emily, did you see the question?
No, Mandy, I did not. And I apologize. Technical difficulties working from home. Can you repeat it?
Well, it's not really a question. It's in the audience chat. Alan from Arizona is sharing how Arizona spent some of their CRF, and I just wondered if you wanted to comment on that.
So for whatever reason, I think because I hopped off, I can't see any of the audience chat.
Oh, okay.
But I'm happy to comment on it.
Arizona used a portion of CRF, close to $400 million, among several funds to offset agency spending, primarily in the Department of Corrections. Whether this is a justified use of the CRF is debatable. The governor's rationale is that it fits under the presumption of public safety spending under the September 2nd Treasury guidance.
Yeah, so there has been other states that have devoted their funds to the Department of Corrections or correctional facilities. And I kind of usually tell people that I don't know exactly what the expenses are being used for, but if they were not, if they need to be used but for the pandemic, that's typically under the guidance. So whether it is, creating a specific facility or medical area for employees or those people at the facility, then that's okay. Or if there are different procedures or payroll expenses related to overtime because of certain public health safety measures, those are typically eligible expenses.
Okay, and then it says Michigan did the same thing with corrections.
There's also, Mandy, and I just want to note, there has also been some funds devoted to courts as well. So we, in our database, we combine courts and corrections, and that's really in result to the increased caseload that courts are seeing.
Okay, and then Jason Powell has another question. How many states are using a deposit to the Unemployment Insurance Trust as a final backstop deposit?
So using their CRF for their unemployment insurance trust funds?
Yes.
I believe that at this point there are close to 15 states that are using their CRF for their unemployment insurance trust funds. And there are also states, sorry, Mandy, that are using the funds to the actual administration, the offices, for their additional expenses as well.
And Martha Wigton from Georgia just added that Georgia's using over $1 billion for that purpose. Okay, great. So I have a question about CRF. Like, one of the questions that we get a lot is, how are states helping small businesses? So what are some of the ways that states are designing their small business relief plans using CRF funds?
Sure. So it really runs the gamut, but as I mentioned in my presentation, a lot of them are through grants or short-term loans. States are designing the programs based on the greatest need, typically. So whether or not that's industry specific or group specific, but we're also seeing states, provide a percentage of lost revenue. Indiana has created a program like that. There are also states that are only really allowing eligible businesses that did not receive the Paycheck Protection Program loans early on in the beginning. So those states that need to fill those gaps but didn't receive that additional federal assistance. And then there are programs, I believe Kathy may have mentioned this, there are programs that are being designed that the grant or short-term loan deadline is bumped up, so it doesn't fall too close to that December 30th deadline. And I'd be curious, Kathy, if you have any insight onto any, not to put you on the spot, any business programs that are happening in Minnesota.
I know that Minnesota's Department of Economic and Employment has programs. I'd have to defer to one of my fellow analysts to answer those questions in particular. But what I did notice with the CARES Act monies used by counties, they have been about 50%, at least in a couple of counties, have been allocated for external uses. And a good portion of that has been for business assistance. And it would be grants up to $10,000. And so you might find that business assistance is happening within each of these smaller allocations. And so it will be really great to be able to and I've seen now that Bill Marks has provided in the chat box that there's been 60 million in grants to small businesses. And that's separate and apart from what we've allocated to local governments.
Yeah, Kathy, that's a great point that there are different allocation amounts for those grants. And I've seen, somewhere between like 3,000 per business, even as high as 75,000. And there are states that are designing multiple programs. Montana comes to mind that they have, I want to say, like 5 or 6 different business programs devoted to livestock or agriculture. They also have I believe, a loan deferment program, but I may be misspeaking, but it's something in the short-term, long-term loan range. So I believe states are really trying to hone in on what businesses really need those needs, or really need those dollars the most.
Great. Thanks, Emily. And this actually takes us pretty much to the end of time. So unless anyone has any last question, we will go ahead and start wrapping up here. I want to thank everyone for participating. Marcia, Emily, Kathy, thank you so much. We appreciate all the expertise you were able to provide. And thank you all to our attendees for participating. We appreciate your time and attention. And like I said, and several people had questions in the chat, the recording and presentation slides will be available on NCSL website within a few days. And I also want to invite you all to tune in next week for our third fall fiscal webinar, third in our series of 5 fall fiscal webinars. On this next one will be public pension management tools in action. That will include borrowing, other innovative approaches to stabilize costs and fill the gaps. Then on November 12th, we have a webinar featuring a state budget and tax update. And on November 19th, our webinar will be focused on state tax trends. So this brings us to the conclusion of the webinar. If you have any questions following this event, please feel free to contact NCSL. And again, thank you for your attention.